My name is Emily Rose Carter. I'm 38 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a third-floor walk-up that smells faintly of coffee and rain. Two constants that keep me steady. I work as a case manager for a community clinic, which means my days are full of other people's brokenness and my nights are mostly quiet. Right now, I am somewhere between exhausted and hollow, because last week my father died, and tomorrow we are reading his will. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The house where I grew up was a 2-story farmhouse on the edge of town, paint flaking like the bark of a tired tree. It hummed in my memory. The creak of the porch step, the clink of a bronze key on an old ring, the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with the sweetness of canned peaches. Those small things are the kind of details that circle back to haunt you. The funeral was small. Just the necessary faces, the priest who had known us for years, and my sister Claire, who wore a dress that was too bright for the grief of the room. Claire smiled through the funeral the way she always had. Polished, practiced, like she was performing kindness out of habit. She is 2 years older than me, with a laugh that used to drown our fights and a talent for making people like her. People always liked Claire. It frustrated me once, then it left me hollow later. For most of my adult life I have been the one who stayed. Stayed for late-night car repairs, stayed when the carpets needed cleaning, stayed because someone had to be there to make the coffee and hold the flashlight over my father's trembling hands. Claire stayed for Instagram photos and weekend trips. She would show up for birthdays and shine, then go. The attorney's office where the will reading was scheduled smelled of lemon disinfectant and the paper snap of legal pads. The conference room had a long table, a window with Venetian blinds, and an array of folding chairs. My hands still remember the texture of the wood rail of our church pew, but sitting in these corporate chairs felt colder, more judgmental. The clock ticked audibly, and outside the glass door a late autumn breeze tangled fallen leaves in the parking lot. I kept thinking about the way my father had been in the last year, thin as paper, stubborn as stone. His hands always shaking slightly when he tried to button his shirts. He'd been an army mechanic once, with hands that knew how to coax old radios back to life. Later he turned to bottles when the noises in his head got too loud. He could be gentle and cruel in the same afternoon. There was a cabinet of photos in our hallway, wedding pictures with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, a childhood snapshot where my sister's arm was slung possessively around me. I had spent so much time trying to justify the bad things with small acts of care, thinking love could rearrange what was broken. Claire arrived late, as if timing could soften the glare. She smelled like a salon and something floral that made the stale attorney office feel suddenly foreign. She slid into a seat, fingers twining with a diamond that used to be my grandmother's. Claire had always liked things that announced themselves. When she caught my eye, she offered a quick smile, the kind that shields and flatters at once. Our mother used to say we were two sides of the same coin. I was the underside, dull, supporting, unremarked, and Claire the shiny face everyone admired. That image had stung for years. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Winters, introduced himself with the careful manners of someone who deals with other people's final words for a living. "This will was executed 3 months ago, in the presence of 2 witnesses, he said, and his voice had the flatness of someone telling bad news politely. He laid an envelope on the table and the room seemed to inhale. Before the envelope was opened, my chest pulsed with that old hollow fever. The desire for things to be fair, the simple childish wish that my quiet years of care would translate into validation. But fairness had not been a currency in my house. The last time my father had said he was proud of me was the night I stayed up with him during a fever, and my mother had kissed my hair and said nothing else. The will sitting on the table felt like a measure now. Not of money or property, but of worth. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. We were a small audience. The attorney, Claire, me and Mr. Davis, the neighbor who'd helped my father in the yard and who had once been a friend of the family. My hands were folded in my lap. The fluorescent light above hummed. The paper in Mr. Winters' hands smelled like ink and dust. He slipped a finger into the corner of the envelope and began to read. He read coldly, each clause precise. then softened as he spoke the personal letter my father had appended. The details were quiet at first. Bequests to a charity, the property to be sold, a note about the family Bible being left to the church. Everything ordinary, everything measured. When he opened the second envelope, a personal letter to be read aloud, I felt my ribs tighten in a way that made me breathe shallow. The letter was my father's voice, finally unmediated. He had never been a man of many soft words, but this letter had the rawness of someone trying to say what had crooked in his chest. He began with apologies, then a list of memories. It was intimate and enraging in the same breath, and I could feel the room listening like a held hand. That single uninterrupted first section ends here, but I hope you're still with me. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. When I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the muffled thud of my father's boots on the back porch, the little rhythms of the house that used to make me feel safe. I grew up with a soundtrack of broken things. Radiators that hissed in the winter, the click of the old heater coming on, the low static of the radio on the kitchen counter late at night when my parents would drink and talk about regrets. My mother used to hum without finishing the melody, as though everything she started dissolved into a reluctance that lived in her chest. She had left us when I was 19. The small bruised silence she left shaped everything. I was good at staying. I learned to move quietly and to anticipate moods. If my father woke in the night, I would be the one to make tea and sit at the edge of the bed until his breathing steadied. If my sister needed money, I gave what I had. Claire was the kind of person who could leave a room lightened. Her laughter was an eclipse of all the smaller sorrows. But sometimes that brightness hid a shadow I couldn't name when I was a child. She would take our allowance and not tell us. She would borrow the car and not return it clean. When I confronted her, she'd grin and say, "Emily, relax. I got this." And I did relax because it was easier than anger. When I was 22, I had a miscarriage in the bathroom at our kitchen sink. I remember the cold porcelain and the way the fluorescent light made everything unbearably clear. I didn't tell anyone right away. I don't think I told Claire at all. I folded that grief into the usual silence and kept taking the ferry of daily tasks. Grocery shopping, doctor appointments, the endless small tending of a man who refused help until he needed it most. That silence later became a small, private wound that sent its edges into everything I did. Claire left for 2 months 5 years ago and then for 10. She told me she was traveling for work, then later that the trip had turned into a life with someone new. She moved to Charlotte, to a glassed apartment, to a calendar full of brunches. She called occasionally. Those calls were bright and brief. Once when my father was in the hospital and my mother already gone from our lives, Claire texted a photo of a sunset and wrote, "Thinking of you." I held the phone and felt as though someone had touched me across a glass panel. We had not spoken in depth in years. Our conversations were a bank of polite exchanges, a careful policing of what was said and what was not. At the time, my life felt defined by small, dutiful acts. I visited my father at odd hours, I cleared leaves from the gutters, I moved his heavy recliner from one room to another when the carpet was cleaned. I never thought about money because it felt like a vulgar, impractical thing given our family. It was only in flurries, bills stuffed in envelopes, wads of unpaid invoices, that I realized neglect takes a form that is measurable. My father had been swindled in his later years by people who came bearing investment opportunities, and a few checks were missing. I noticed them quietly in the back of the checkbook when I balanced his account. I confronted him once, and he stared at me like I had suggested a betrayal where none existed. I learned to let those things lie, because raising the question always ended in a fistful of apologies and a promise he never kept. So when rumors started, quiet, dangerous whispers in the town about Claire's sudden wealth, my gut tightened. She had inherited something. She had gotten engaged to a man with money. In a town like ours, people noticed the flicker of new clothes and new cars. But she had always been resourceful with appearances. She managed to take charm and tilt it until people gave her what she wanted without questioning. I had become the repository of grudges, partly by choice and partly out of fear. Fear that if I spoke my truth, I'd be the one to break the family further. I had learned to weigh my words like precious coins. I spent them sparingly. The will felt like the reckoning of all that silent arithmetic. If this was a chance to see how my father chose to measure us, then the numbers, however they fell, would be the kind of fact that forces a reckoning regardless of who we think we are. When Mr. Winters read my father's personal thoughts, he spoke about memory and regret. He spoke, in the measured cadences of a legal man reading more than legal text, of a hurt that had become stubborn and cold. I watched Claire, who was smiling politely, as if certain the sunlight of her life would not be dimmed by the thin paper in front of us. She was beautiful in the way grief sometimes framed people. Bright, luminous. She sat with her hands folded like a picture, until the lawyer's voice changed shape and a line came through that felt like a stone dropping into water. If you're still here, please consider hitting subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. Helps more than you know. You don't deserve anything. Those were the words Mr. Winters read aloud, the sentence standing alone like a verdict. They were simple, brutal, and they belonged to my father. For a second, the sound of them seemed not to fit the antiseptic hush of the conference room. Claire's smile faltered in a way that a photographer might later call vulnerability, but it was more devastating than any staged pose. The bright line of her mouth knotted. Her fingers, which had been resting lightly on the tabletop, dug into the skin of her knuckles. To my daughter Claire, my father's voice, translated into Mr. Winters' calm vocal cords, began. You don't deserve anything from me. You left when I needed you and came back only when it suited you. You took pleasure in what you could get and neglected what you could not see. You abandoned your responsibilities and then pretended to love me when it was convenient. I cannot in good faith leave you anything that would reward that behavior. It was as if the room contracted. I had always imagined the worst-case scenarios. Being left without anything, being erased by a man whose language of love had been intermittent. But I had not expected the savage specificity, a line like a bright cleaver meant to cut. I felt 1,000 reactions at once. Part of me wanted to stand and say, he was my father too, because it was true and because I had spent years without his praise. Another part felt nothing, the way you can feel nothing when a wound has been lanced too many times to register anew. Claire's voice came out low at first, then sharp. What is this? She said. This is ridiculous. He couldn't have written this. Her fingers trembled. He loved me. Everyone knows he loved me. Your father left a personal codicil, Mr. Winters replied, coolly measured. He wanted me to read it aloud. If you have questions, you'll be given a copy. But the instructions are clear. Who wrote this? Claire demanded. What? Who convinced him? He wrote it, Mr. Winters said softly. He signed it before witnesses. There was a silence like the pause between a car crash and the long after. Claire's face rearranged itself from stunned denial into accusation. Emily, she said, eyes flashing toward me with something that could have been triumph or fear. You had him write something against me. You manipulated him. You. The accusation landed like a slap, the kind that leaves an aftershock in the sternum. I had imagined, oddly often, the scene where Claire would stand and finally face me, where words would come pouring out and we would be cleansed by shouting. In truth, the accusation felt petty, like a child's grab for the last cookie. I answered calmly, because that's what you do when the stakes are older than your breath. Claire, I wasn't there when he had this written. I don't know what's in it. I'm listening like you are. You're lying, she said. I used to take care of him too. I came back when he needed me the most. You always make the martyr about yourself. Claire, you always make everything about you, she cut me off. Her voice scraped. Do you remember when you left that note on the counter? The one that said you'd been sick and disappeared for a week. You abandoned him, Emily. You left him to us. You left him to me. Her words were like thrown glass. I felt the edges catch in my chest. I could hear Mr. Davis clearing his throat, trying to be useful and failing. Ladies, maybe we should let Mr. Winters continue, he offered. His voice wobbled. He had, in a way, been the one to bring us almond cookies when my father was in the hospital. His loyalty was small. His kindness was real. Mr. Winters unpacked the codicil further. My father's letter did not simply disinherit. It provided detail. He named charitable organizations that had cared for him in small but meaningful ways, and he made provisions for the house to be sold if no family member wanted it. He left instructions for his funeral to be scaled back. He asked, in plain language, that the money be used to pay off debts and to establish a small fund for community youth to take vocational classes. Then he wrote, plainly and unforgivingly, that Claire would receive no personal bequest. There was more. The lawyer spoke of a ledger my father had left, bank statements, cancelled checks, and a pile of photos. There are notes here, he said, detailing certain withdrawals and transfers that your father believes were taken without consent. He was very clear in his instructions. He did not want his estate to be used to reward theft. Claire's face flushed with anger and then shame. That's a lie, she said, the words like spit. Those were gifts. He gave me money. She stopped, and for a beat she was suddenly small, the brilliant armor scraped away. I didn't know he would read this and then. No, I said. You did know, Claire. You came back when you needed him, then you took what you wanted. You tried to make it look like you cared. My words were sharper than I expected. They felt like a rope cut loose. I didn't want to inflict pain for the joy of it. I wanted to name a pattern that had been there for years, to see the truth of it articulated. Claire's breath came in a broken rhythm. You always think you're the victim, she threw at me. Do you have any idea how hard it is to carry this? To be judged. To be the one everyone thinks is selfish. Claire, I said, quieter, and the room seemed to listen because my voice had run out of armor. I didn't want this. I wanted him to be honest, but I didn't want him to hurt you the way he's hurting himself. I stayed because someone had to. I didn't stay to get something. I stayed because I love him even when he was impossible. Love, she said, the word thin as tissue. Where does love fit in, Emily? Why should it be measured by who sits with him at night? Why does it have to be some sort of ledger? I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her about the nights when I woke with my heart hammering, when my hands of their own accord searched for the cup of water my father would insist on. I wanted to tell her about the small domestic mercies that stack up into a life. But the will had drawn a line. My father's words had exposed fissures in our family that no apology could bridge in a conference room. For a while the attorney read the rest of the codicil in that flat, polite voice that legal men use to let emotion fall where it may. Claire sat very still, then got up and walked out of the room without a word. The sound of the office door closing was a small, final click. I watched her go, and a part of me wanted to run after her and stitch the break with whatever thread was left. Another part of me recognized that some things aren't fixable by chasing. If this moment has struck a chord with you, please hit like. These stories reach more people that way, and it helps us keep telling them. After Claire left, the room felt suddenly too big. Mr. Winters folded the papers with a kind of reverence and handed me a copy of the codicil. My hands shook when I took it. The paper was thin but heavy with consequence. Mr. Davis lingered, his face taut. I'm sorry, he said to both of us, and the apology felt like someone trying to stitch together a rent curtain with mismatched thread. There was a strange moral math in the weeks that followed. Claire's departure from the conference room wasn't the end. There were phone calls, at first furious, then pleading, then litigious. Claire retained an attorney the way she had once retained attention, with a swift, efficient flourish. She contested the will, arguing undue influence, claiming our father had been manipulated in his weakened state. The town's rumor mill, pickled in long habits and old loyalties, began to churn. People took sides with the casual certainties of those who have not been in the room where the real things were said. What surprised me most was how swift the public memory could be. How quickly the private became a public spectacle. Social media filled with opinions from people who had not once crossed our porch line. Some of my father's old friends came forward to testify that he was lucid in the months before his death. Others suggested he had been confused in his final days. Claire's attorney produced statements about my father's state of mind, and my own lawyer advised me to be careful with what I said. In a court of law, memory is a fragile, contestable thing. In a town, reputation can be a weapon. The ledger my father left behind became a battleground. There were bank withdrawals that matched nights when Claire had been in town, cash in enveloped hands, dinners paid for, a new phone plan. My father had labeled many notes with shorthand that made sense only when you lived in the house and knew the cadence of who came and went. A small transfer to a business run by a man Claire had briefly dated was circled in my father's handwriting with a single note. Explain. There were also entries that showed my own small expenditures, groceries, a funeral expense, lined up like a dull record of caretaking. Claire accused me of colluding with the attorney to discredit her. "You wanted this," she told me in an angry voice over the phone. Her words carrying the sharpness of someone trying to make something true by telling it often. "You wanted his money. You wanted to prove you're the better daughter." The accusation landed in me the way a match hits a puddle. "I didn't want his money," I said, and I meant it. Money can change circumstances, but it doesn't rewrite the moments when someone reads you a look. "I wanted him to be honest. I want my name on the house," she said bitterly. You can't have what you didn't earn," I said, harder than I had expected. "You can't have the apology you never gave." We fought in letters and in court filings. We fought in private texts that each felt like an attempt to carve a small truth into stone. There were nights when I lay awake and imagined Claire in a cheap motel room, crying into a pillow. And there were nights when I imagined her on a balcony, wine in hand, her life less complicated than ours, and I wanted to shake her until she understood what she had done. That's the thing about family fights. They hold the capacity to make you alternately tender and barbaric. The court appointed a mediator, and at that mediation we sat in a windowless room and tried to name things we had never spoken out loud. Claire read a letter she said she'd written to my father years ago. An angry, filial note that accused him of selfishness and of preferring me. She said she had loved him in a way she thought deserved recognition. I read from the ledger. The mediator asked us to try to see the other's intention. Intention is a strange thing. It refracts based on who is looking. What came out of the legal back and forth was not a tidy settlement but a compromise that saved us time and public spectacle. Claire walked away with a token payment for emotional lack, and we sold the farmhouse. The house, which for decades had been the archive of our small, bruised lives, was sold to a young couple with bright plans and softer hands. The money was split, less than either of us had hoped for, because debts had been owed and unpaid. We set up the fund my father had wanted for vocational classes in a community center downtown. I managed the fund because it felt like a way to give something of the world back to people who needed it in the practical lifeline way my father had once wanted. Claire and I did not reconcile. We exchanged fewer and fewer messages. There were occasional attempts, texts around holidays, a tentative phone call where she asked how the memorial went, where she used "we" in a way that felt like trying to stitch. Each time I tried to imagine what would allow reconnection, it felt less like a bridge and more like a plaster bandage on a bone that had not healed. I would like to say I forgave, but real forgiveness is not always a single, noble act. Often it is a string of small mercies extended without expectation. People ask me why I kept the little things. My father's toolbox, his old army jacket, the radio he would tune to stations that made him smile. "Why keep these?" they asked, as if objects could be dissected for motive. Those items smell of oil and old wood and the faint tobacco of his shirt. They smell like the nights I sat awake and listened for a breath that would not come. I kept them for the way they anchor me to the fact of him, the complicated fact of him. Not a saint, not a monster. Just a person who did the best he could in the messy architecture he was given. If this resonates, and you want to share a story of your own, please comment below. I read everything, and sometimes your stories are the ones that keep me brave enough to tell mine. Time has a peculiar way of softening edges while sharpening the specifics you choose to keep. Summer turned the leaves green again, and the fund my father requested became a banner hung over a community classroom where teenagers learned carpentry and plumbing and the dignity of a paid day's work. The fund paid for tools and a teacher and a table where someone could learn how to hold a nail without being ashamed. It became a small, stubborn thing of purpose that made me understand the surreal truth of what my father had asked. Not for an apology, but for action. Claire remarried, quickly and quietly. I ran into her once at the yearly memorial for our town's veterans. She looked at me with a quick, flattened expression. It's hard to tell people you once loved deeply that you have neither the time nor the energy to untangle a quarrel. She mouthed the words, "I am sorry," in a movement that was as much a social gesture as a confession. I nodded like someone practicing an expression. Later that night I found my face wet with tears for reasons that had nothing to do with Claire, and everything to do with the small human ache of it all. People, in their kindness and clumsy judgments, asked me if I felt victorious. Some called it karmic justice. To them the story had a moral arc. To me the truth was more granular. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Grief does not evaporate with litigation. You can be legally triumphant and spiritually bankrupt in the same breath. In the quiet, I still had flashbacks to the night I missed a doctor's appointment because my father had fallen asleep on the couch and I couldn't wake him without feeling like an intruder. I still sometimes woke in the small of the night with the old sharp anxiety that I had not done enough. Those things don't dissolve even when a will says otherwise. What I learned in the months after the will is that worth is not dispensed by papers. Worth is not parceled by a signature or a ledger. My father's final words showed me the cruelty of measuring affection in balances and transfers, but they also taught me the importance of boundaries. Keeping the tools and the radio wasn't about clinging to grief in an unhealthy way. It was about honoring the messy love that had existed, flawed as it was. I started seeing a therapist. I started going to a support group for adult children of parents with addiction. Saying the stories aloud in safe rooms peeled them of their sharpest shame. There is an odd beauty in the small acts of repair. I learned to bake my father's favorite cornbread, not as an attempt to resurrect something, but to make something with my own hands that felt steady. I paid off a friend who had loaned me money for the funeral. I donated a portion of the estate to a shelter that had offered our family boxes of food in harder days, and I signed paperwork to ensure the fund would continue beyond me. Those are not grand acts. They are the slow, quiet kind that fit my life. A life of steady work and small paybacks. Claire and I may never be what we once were. Siblings bound by childhood secrets and shared rooms, but I've stopped waiting for that resolution to materialize. I am learning to let people be as they are, even when their choices wound me. Letting go is not forgetting. It's a refusal to let a vice of bitterness keep me hostage. There were nights when I thought of burning Claire's pictures in the attic. There were nights when I thought of forwarding all our correspondence to the town newspaper. Instead I chose, slowly, to separate my peace from her actions. If this story has touched you, please consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, and your support means these voices continue to be heard. The final lesson for me is simple and stubborn. You deserve care whether or not it is lavishly declared in ink. The legal pronouncements my father left were his final attempt to control the narrative of our lives. He was flawed and he was human. He attempted, in the brittle language of the dying, to name what he felt. Those words, "You don't deserve anything," cut Claire, and they cut me in an indirect way too, because they forced us to carry the judgment of a man who loved imperfectly. I have learned, through the ache and the paperwork and the courtrooms and the quiet afternoons with the radio playing softly in the background, that the work of a life is not summed up in inheritance. It is the small acts of tending that matter. Listening on sleepless nights, showing up even when it's inconvenient, choosing generosity that is not performed for an audience. I will likely always carry the ghost of my father's last words in some corner, but I am trying to live in a way where I don't measure my worth by them. Thank you for listening. If this has resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear that family can be complicated and that sometimes the clearest love is the kind that keeps showing up.